Hello there. I am Brian Clark, graduate student at Union College, and this is my action research project entitled Action Research Within Different Learning Styles. It is done for Dr. Bailey's Education 500 class, which is entitled Methods in Action Research. So before I get started, I'd like to thank you for coming and listening to this presentation. And I must say that it was a very fulfilling presentation for me. Had a good time with my students, being that I haven't been a teacher yet. I'm just a football coach. But this summer program that I worked in gave me an opportunity to put my hand in teaching and conducting this action research. And I was very proud of it, very fond of it. And without further ado, let's get started. My two research questions were, should educators accommodate different student learning styles? And the other one is, are educators using the best practices and techniques in order to receive the best outcome for their students as it pertains to learning styles? Or basically, what are educators doing in order to see their students succeed? Are they just teaching them stuff, or are they basically giving them different options on how to learn? Or are students just falling by the wayside? So as we continue, background information. As I said, I'm not a teacher. I'm just a coach working in a summer program. So at the summer program I worked at was at Knox Central High School in Barberville, Kentucky. In it contained 6 students. 10 of them were females and 6 were males, all from Southeast Kentucky. Further background, my purpose was to basically answer those questions. Growing up, I always used different learning styles when I was learning. But I also seen at times that teachers would teach, and there were guys that I knew who couldn't learn by the ways they were teaching. They didn't use different teaching methods. They just used the same ones, and the guys that couldn't follow along just fell by the wayside. But I think given the opportunity to use different learning styles, that could have helped them. So it was my goal to prove that the best method for success in education is to accommodate different student learning styles, and that educators should use the best techniques and practices for accommodating them. Background continued. As I said, I worked at the high school in Barberville, Kentucky, named Knox Central, and all my students came from Southeast Kentucky, and all were Caucasian. There were no African Americans, no Native Americans, no Hispanics, all Caucasian. In my literature review, I really wanted to answer 4 things. 1, what are learning styles? Learning styles are basically described as how students prefer to learn in an educational setting. From Learning Styles, a review of theory and application and best practices by Romanelli, Bird, and Ryan, I found 3 different learning styles that are used commonly and that have been proven to work: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. The next thing I want to answer are, what are different types of learning styles? One I read in a study of students' perception in a blended learning is blended learning, which basically talked about blending learning in a traditional setting as well as learning in a virtual setting or on a computer. And the next question I wanted to answer was the cause of people's different learning styles. Cultural Ways of Learning by Gutierrez and Rogoff explains that some students learn basically from their background. They come from different backgrounds and different cultures, and that simply shapes the way they learn. Also, Cobb's Learning Styles and Learning Spaces gives an answer of experiential learning theory, which gives you 6 parts and also describes different ways of learning. I also want to answer how experts are trying to accommodate them. In the article I read entitled "Do Different Learning Styles Require Different Teaching Strategies?" answers that it supports the idea that students with different learning styles achieve better learning outcomes when confronted with teaching strategies. They respond better to those preferences. And also, in Pashler and McDaniel's Learning Styles, Concepts and Evidence, it says that simply asking students their preference makes for better specialized instruction. My action plan. I wanted to make my action plan simple. First thing I did was I got all the students together and we reviewed simple topics in English, reading comprehension, math, and science. After I gave them a review of the information I was going to give, I gave them a pretest. In that pretest, they only had 10 questions to answer dealing with those 4 topics. And after that, I graded the pretest, and then I gave them a learning style questionnaire. Within the learning style questionnaire, after they answered all the questions that was conducted in them, I took that and broke them into 3 groups. From what I learned from my literature review, I broke them into auditory learners, visual learners, and also kinesthetic learners. From those groups, I gave each group specialized learning strategies that they would use for about a week. After a week's time, I gave them a post-test. From the post-test, I was able to see whether the student scores better from the pretest to post-test, which also gave me an example of whether students using different learning strategies would help them with their schoolwork and better their chances of getting better test grades. My data collection was retrieved from my learning style questionnaire as well as pre and post test results. As I collected data, it was seen in the table shown that actually student scores did improve. From pre-test, they had a slightly below average score of 61.8, and after the post-test, their scores rose to an average score, which is 78.13. And the standard deviation proved that they had less hassle from pre-test to post-test. As I continued my data, I learned that visual learners had the best test scores out of all my students. They rose from 71% to 84% pre-test to post-test. And also I learned that auditory learners showed the biggest improvement from pre-test to post-test, as it went from 56% to 78%, a 22% increase. Results showed some pretty staggering numbers that most students' scores actually did improve from pre-test to post-test after they received specialized learning strategies to work with within their different categories. I actually had 4 outliers. Three students' scores actually stayed the same, and 1 student's score actually dropped. As it can be seen on the table to the right, students who score stayed the same already had an average to an above average score. So it wasn't much change for those students. The student whose score went down already had an average score and then went down to below average. So as I did my data analysis, I was able to understand that with more time with my action research, I could have conducted a better one. Reason being, I only made 10 questions for my pre and post test, so I could have an easier time to collect data. It's also made it easier for students to understand what they were studying, and it gave me an example of whether these learning strategies were working. So I think in the future, with more research, I could, help students with more practices on how they could, achieve success in the classroom using these strategies. In my reflection, I think overall my questions were answered. Second one in part, but the first one was definitely answered. I think students definitely felt more comfortable when their learning style preference was accommodated. In part, my second question was answered. I think it's best said that when students are accommodated, teachers would thrive. But that's not the case for all teachers. Some teachers see it best for students to adapt to their style of teaching. So I think it's best for teachers to use the best practices and methods to accommodate different learning styles, because in all students have different learning styles, and I think it's best that we accommodate them. The next step, within the future, I think more strategies and practices will come about as researchers do more research. With that research being done, I think it will put an edge on stakeholders to incorporate these different teaching strategies within the classroom so that different learning styles will be accommodated. As you can see in my appendix, I gave you the questionnaire in part, and also I gave you in part what the different pre-test and post-test look like. So once again, I think this was a very fulfilling process in action research. I think more research will be done on this topic, and I think it will definitely be for the betterment of education as a whole. I thank you for listening. Hope that this was helpful for anybody out there looking on how to accommodate different learning strategies. And once again, my name is Brian Clark. Thank you.